These days, it seems to me that every big new show I've been watching has a companion podcast, from HBO's Succession and Netflix's The Crown, to more recently, HBO's Julia and Apple TV's We Crashed. Companion podcasts really seem to be just everywhere. If you haven't discovered any of them yet, companion podcasts are produced by the TV networks and streaming services who made the show the podcast is talking about. The podcast episodes are published almost immediately after each weekly release of the TV episodes. In the sea of TV and film podcasts, companion podcasts stand apart from the rest, not only because of their high production quality, but because of the access they have to interviewing the creatives and experts behind the show. Companion podcasts dive into the making of the show or provide a bit more context about the world the show takes place in. For example, in the Succession podcast, journalist Kara Swisher interviews professionals from business, political, and psychology backgrounds to provide real-world perspectives on the hilarious things that go on within each Succession episode. It's no secret that the podcast industry has been growing tremendously over the years. In 2020, there were 75 million monthly podcast listeners in the United States, with most people listening to podcasts while doing other activities like driving or cooking. This number is expected to increase even more, growing to about 100 million monthly listeners by 2024. Since podcasts have so much of audiences' attention, it's natural that businesses are turning to podcasting to get their products and services in front of people. And with the streaming wars being such a tight race, all the streaming services definitely want a piece of that podcast pie too. In fact, according to the Wall Street Journal, both Netflix and HBO have recently been investing a lot of money into creating companion podcasts in order to make their shows more discoverable outside of their paid streaming platforms. But while podcasts are free for listeners, podcasts can cost a lot of money to produce. Depending on the type of content, each podcast episode can cost more than $10,000 to make, and they also don't even have any ads within them to offset any costs. For a show like Succession, which had 9 episodes in its 3rd season, a companion podcast can cost $90,000 to produce. And that's not even including paid ads for the podcast itself. So, is it worth it? Have companion podcasts been successful? The short answer is yes. After HBO aired the first episode of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl podcast rose in the podcast ranks to be the 2nd most popular show across all categories on Apple Podcast. Jim Marsh, the Senior Vice President of Digital Marketing and Content at HBO, has even said that many consider the podcast to be almost a required part of the Chernobyl viewing experience. Netflix's behind-the-scenes Stranger Things podcast has also been quite popular, making it to 3rd on the charts. But in terms of increasing the discoverability of the show, I'm not actually too sure if companion podcasts are truly the way to go. On face value, companion podcasts seem to be about marketing in a medium that has an increasing pool of audiences. But I don't think these podcasts are successful in actually convincing audiences to sign up to the platform and give the show a try. Because if you've never heard of a show before, why would you listen to a podcast about it? And if you've heard of the show, but still haven't watched the show, you're probably not interested in the show at all, and the podcast just wouldn't be relevant to you. And for both of these audience groups, even if they were on the fence about a show, a podcast album cover just isn't very convincing when it comes to influencing someone to watch a show. More generally, let's say you already are watching the show and would listen to the companion podcast. You've already discovered the show, so the podcast isn't converting you to watch the show because you didn't need to be convinced in the first place. So why do networks and streaming services keep pumping out these companion podcasts? Well, I think the networks aren't trying to create buzz around the show by spending $10,000 per podcast episode. No, instead, these companion podcasts are actually made for the people who are already engaged with the show. These are people who are looking for more content throughout the week to keep themselves entertained while they wait for the next episode. There's always a bit of a build-up before the show airs, and some excitement and discussion after the episode is released. But between those moments, there's not really that much content to keep conversations going. These companion podcasts help fill in that time gap and keep audiences engaged throughout the week. This actually happened to me during the 3rd season of Succession. A couple days after the first episode aired, I was on my YouTube newsfeed, and the Succession podcast showed up on the list. I clicked on it, of course, and then started listening to the companion podcast throughout the season. YouTube's algorithm knew that I was a fan of the show, and that this was content that would be relevant to me. But if there was no podcast, I would have clicked on another video, and my attention would be on something else. You see, HBO wants me to keep thinking about Succession, because the more I think about the characters, plot twists, and satirical representations of real life, the more engaged with the show I become. In that way, companion podcasts maintain TV show fandoms and encourage people to become mega fans of a show. If you think about it, the types of content within companion podcasts actually existed in another form before. When you get a DVD box set of your favorite show, there are usually some featurettes and bloopers included in the box. Nowadays, very few people buy DVDs and box sets anymore, which is a shame because the behind-the-scenes content are what fans love to watch, and they really help to reinforce the fandom months after the show was aired. Besides no one buying DVDs anymore, the release of these box sets is also too slow for the current audience attention span. We move on from shows much quicker than before, and we are more susceptible to losing interest partway through a show because there are now so many other forms of content that we can consume. And so, the DVD box set featurettes had to be reformatted to suit modern audience consumption habits. One of the forms it took was the companion podcast, which still serves up the behind-the-scenes content that fans love, and it also matches the attention span of current-day audiences. Maintaining fandom is undoubtedly beneficial for the shows, because a popular show gets renewed and can continue to make money. But cultivating loyal fans for a show can also be beneficial to the streaming services too. In the tight race of the streaming wars, these providers are fighting for loyal subscribers. And while marketing the shows that are available on the platform helps to attract audiences to the streaming platform, these audiences might watch the show that they're interested in, but they might not stay subscribed to the service forever. Instead, the more relevant, quality content a network can get in front of someone, the more likely that audience member is going to start forming a bond and start trusting in the network of their new favorite show. For instance, as someone who watched Succession and listened to its companion podcast, I am more likely to watch an HBO show because they have provided me with great content in the past, meaning I am more likely to subscribe and stay subscribed to HBO Max. In that sense, companion podcasts aren't for improving discoverability of the shows, but instead, it's to help audiences maintain interest in shows and for networks to form stronger bonds with existing subscribers. But one last thought. While I did listen to the Succession companion podcast during season 3, I do have to admit that the podcast wasn't my preferred podcast content. And yet, I still listened to it while waiting for new Succession episodes, because there was no other new Succession content until the next week. This does generally make me wonder whether companion podcasts really need to be that good at all. Because if fans are loyal enough, they'll be willing to listen to any podcast talking about their favorite show. It also makes me wonder about the possibilities of companion podcasts, or rather, contemporary forms of companion material. Like for Apple TV's Severance, the show was released with a companion book that was free to download. Through a different perspective, the book provides audiences with more clues about Lumen, the company that neurologically separates their employees' personal and work lives in the show. I personally think a companion book filled with clues is a much more immersive and exciting experience for the mega fans out there. But the format of companion material will have to depend on the show's story and its audience. A companion book might seem fitting for audiences of Severance, but Succession's wide range of audiences would most likely prefer a podcast because the show is about satirical commentary on current-day business and political affairs. Companion material has existed for many years, decades even, but it's still early days for companion podcasts. I'm really looking forward to seeing how networks and streaming services continue to adapt to contemporary ways of consuming content, and how they might also cross into other formats, like podcasting or ebooks, in order to continue to improve engagement with their audiences.